Welcome. Hi, everybody. I'm going to introduce myself. I'm SaraGrace Vann. I am the coordinator of Foster and Homeless Youth Services here at SCCOE, and I'm here with Kurt.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Kurt McLachlan, and I'm a manager for education services for foster youth, and I work with SaraGrace.
And now we'd like to know a little bit about who's here, who's in the room. Who is a classroom teacher? Awesome. Special education teacher? General ed teacher? I know, I was being optimistic. Do we have one? Oh, yay. Great, because we can't have a meeting without a gen ed teacher in the room, as you know. So thank you for being here. You're critical. I love it. I think we should. And yet, I do find that there are some differences in expectations. And I love when we're talking about MTSS and restorative practices and understanding healing-informed language and healing-informed practices, it is often my special education staff who really just has that, just understands it intuitively. So we thank you for being here today. So we had a lot of teachers, we have a lot of special education staff. How about site administrators? Cool. District administrators. Very good. SELPA? Nope. Okay. Parents. Teachers, students. We're all part of the team. So that's why I asked. Community partners. Excellent. How about preschool teachers? Okay. Let's see. Special education staff, non-teaching staff, and non-admin. Excellent. It takes all of the partners on the team to move forward to identify our resources for our toolkit. And that's a lot of what we're going to be doing today, is identifying strategies. We'll talk about some strategies for you, and there's also strategies that we hope that you will be able to get from each other as far as filling your toolkit to be able to apply healing-informed practices and move into restorative justice. I can't keep track of my clicker. Was that it? Is that the right one? No, that's the wrong side, but that's the right one. There we go. So what we're going to do today, we're going to take a look at healing-informed strategies in the context of neuroscience and human needs. We're going to look at restorative justice as a healing-informed practice within the MTSS framework. And we're going to identify strategies and practices for a healing-informed and restorative toolkit. We use the phrase healing-informed because we usually hear trauma-informed, right? That's what you hear. We use healing-informed because our emphasis is on the healing. We don't need to be informed necessarily about the trauma, what the trauma is. We know that there is trauma and that there is chronic stress. So what we're looking at is how we can contribute as educators to the healing. And that's why we have an emphasis on healing-informed practices. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look at the mechanisms behind effective strategies for youth with trauma and chronic stress. We're going to organize those strategies and practices into a healing-informed and MTSS framework. This is not an RJ training, a restorative justice training. That takes like 6 hours for individuals to get certified. It takes 3 to 5 years for a school site to fully implement restorative justice. But what we do hope that you will be able to take away today is understanding how restorative practices align with MTSS and are a manifestation of healing-informed practice. So where all of that fits so that you can take this back to your teams. How many of you are at school sites that have some level of restorative justice implementation, either in your site or your classroom. Okay. Yeah, some maybe a little bit. Some of you might find that you are using some restorative practices in your classroom or on your site, even without full restorative justice implementation. And so that's what we're hoping to share today, is about the continuum. And then you can take this back to your school sites, to your PLCs, to your departments, so that you can look at that and see where on your team this might be able to be expanded. I'm going to hand it over to Kurt for a little bit of grounding and mindfulness.
So this activity and grounding is going to ask you to participate with me. As you can see up there, it's a big giant heart and there's a tree inside of it. So you'll have to put down your devices. You'll have to listen to what I'm going to give you as far as directions. And you're going to be thinking and grounding yourself as a part of humanity. So close your eyes and imagine a tree. I provided you one. Maybe you're thinking of another one. So what does your tree look like? So the leaves that are on your tree represent a breath. And so we're going to reach up to that tree. We're going to be taking 5 of those breaths and touching out to 5 of those leaves. All right. The breaths have to come from way down deep inside. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. So breathing in for 3 counts. 1, 2, 3. Breathing out. 1, 2, 3. And that's leaf number 1. Leaf number 2. Breathing in. 1, 2, 3. And breathing out. 1, 2, 3. Breathing in. 1, 2, 3. Holding it for a moment and breathing out. 1, 2, 3. And for the remaining leaves, I'm going to let you do that on your own. And I'm bringing you back from your tree, from your breaths. And we're hoping that you're grounded with us today, remembering that humanity goes all the way to the roots of this tree and is together to make this tree live and become alive.
Thank you, Kurt. You're going to find that regulation is really important in this work, not only for students to be regulated, but also for us to be regulated. So we really want to, even in the busyness and in the slightly shorter session time than we expected, we really want to make time to make sure that we can all be regulated in order to do the work. I picked up the wrong one. Okay. Kurt, would you please hide this one from me? Thank you. All right, very quick overview of MTSS. I think I've got the superstar group today. So how familiar are we with MTSS? Yes, way good, sort of, kind of, heard of it, but okay, great, awesome. So we're familiar with this framework. This is what we're going to be moving forward with as we talk about restorative practices. So who was in the heard the keynote yesterday from Jeff Duncan Andrade, right? I was super excited about that because he totally set us up. We are going to talk about Bruce Perry, the researcher that he mentioned in neuroscience, and how he talks about the structures of the brain and what he's termed the neurosequential model. And he has a neurosequential model for education. And this is super important because it's going to lead into some basic human needs, and will really lay a foundation for our work today. So I'm going to move forward because we're not going to do the whole 7 minutes.
You need to understand about the brain is the way the brain processes incoming information. And the reason that's so important is that the human brain is basically organized in a hierarchy. So there's kind of a bottom part of the brain, a middle part, and then the top part. And the top part is an area we call the cortex, and I think most everybody's heard of it. And the cortex is the most uniquely human part of the brain. And all of the networks up in the cortex are the systems that help us learn language. They're responsible for sort of autobiographical memory. They're responsible for the ability to think about the future, to think about the past, and essentially every topic that an educator will teach has to get to systems in the cortex. And so really the job of the educator, and the job of the coach, and the job of the parent, and the job of anybody who wants to sort of change the human part of the brain is to get to the cortex. Now, the dilemma is that when I talk with you, the sound waves are translated into pattern neuronal activity that go into lower parts of the brain. And then they get processed, and then they go to the middle part of the brain, and they get processed, and then they finally get to the top part of the brain. And so you don't automatically teach by having a really good thing in the teacher's cortex that immediately gets into the cortex of the child. And so what you have to do is get through the middle part of the teacher's brain, the lower part of the teacher's brain, out into space, into the lowest part of the student's brain, into the middle part of the student's brain, and then finally up to the cortex. So there's a lot of places where that can go wrong. And the reason educators need to understand a little bit about stress, distress, and trauma is that all of those things will interfere with that process in ways sometimes subtle, but sometimes in really extreme ways. You may have a child who comes into the classroom who is very well regulated. Their stress response system is completely normal. And what that means is when they're sitting and listening in a classroom that's predictable, consistent, the teacher's kind, and their cortex is open for business, which means that the teacher will successfully be able to get through sort of that, that obstacle course to get to the cortex. But if somebody has a history of trauma, the stress response system will be abnormally activated. And that will shut down the cortex so that even if you're a really good teacher, the incoming input, the words and nonverbal cues and all of the things that you use to teach, they're going to get short-circuited on the way to the cortex. And that child will not learn as much.
This is why I was so excited. Remember when he talked about Maslow and then he went and talked about Bruce Perry? Well, we did it the other way around, but it's the same thing here. And what they're saying is the same, that in order for a student's cortex to be open for business so that they can do the learning and the self-actualization, then their brainstem needs to be open. They need to be out of the fight or flight phase of the brain. They need to not be concerned about safety and physiological needs, arousal, sleep, appetite, movement. this matches up with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So it's the neuroscience alignment of what we've known from Maslow since 1943. So that's why this is so exciting. What this means is that students who have experienced chronic stress or recurrent trauma, they can get stuck down here in the lower portions of the brain. They get stuck in fight or flight. It also manifests in the physical development of their brain structures. Children and adolescents who have experienced chronic stress, recurrent trauma, their brains develop differently. It's visible on brain scans. Their brains actually are smaller, and particularly in the prefrontal cortex, the area that we're trying to get to access the reasoning and the learning. And the good news is that when we as educators engage in healing-informed practices, we can help heal those synapses in the brain. And we can help heal the student and help them to be able to access the cortex. What this looks like in practice is that students need to be able to regulate, and they need to be in relationship. They need to feel a sense of belonging before they can reason and reflect on their behaviors and their goals. Before they reach these levels of self-actualization, they need to be able to regulate in their body and in their minds, and they need to feel like they are in relationship, in community, and have a sense of belonging. This is true for adults also. Teachers need to be regulated in order to help students to regulate, but also when you're in a tense IEP meeting, you may be working with a parent who is dysregulated because the IEP is a version of reliving the parent's trauma. The trauma of learning their child's diagnosis, the trauma of fighting for services for their child, the trauma of grieving their expectations, the loss of what they expected for their child. So when we're in IEP meetings and things are tense, it's really important to remember this is not a difficult parent. This is not one of those parents. This is a parent who is dysregulated because we are activating their trauma by sitting in that meeting. And I have a personal anecdote about that for anyone who is willing to postpone their lunch and stay after, but I'm not going to move on to it now because we need our physiological needs to be met in order to be regulated, and I have no intention of standing between you and lunch. Unless I skipped a page, I think we're on to you next, right? Okay.
So thank you, SaraGrace, for reminding all of us it is not just the students that we're paying attention to for regulation, but it's also the educators that are in that space with the students. Up here on this slide, we have a couple of comparisons. And I guess that's kind of a double entendre. Sorry about that if you're an English major. So on the one side, we have academic errors. And on the one side, we have behavioral errors. And so I'm going to give you just a moment to look at that, and then I want to discuss it a little bit further. So when you're looking at the comparison, if we take the very first piece of that academic side, errors are noted as accidents or mistakes. And that's how we learn. That's what the teacher would say, right? Oh, this will improve. You just made this mistake this one time, so we're going to get it right next time, right? The question is, when it's a behavioral error, do we do the same as an educator? Do we say, oh, you know, that thing that you just did, that involved that incident with that other student, right? That was just a mistake, and we're going to improve on it next time. Or does it sound different? Does it sound like you shouldn't have made that mistake? We've talked about that with the expectations, and so now here's your consequence. That sounds much different. On the second piece, bound to happen. So in order to learn, we have to make mistakes. If you're perfect, I don't know you, but bound to happen. That's how we learn. So we make errors in academics, right? And then you fix them, you revise, you come to a different conclusion that's correct. If you look at the behavioral side, should never happen. So like I said, if you're perfect, I don't know you. But I'm sure at some different point during our lives even, we have had made errors in behaviors. And if you haven't, well, congratulations. Maybe you can come shake my hand after. But it's important to remember that the learning has to take place with behavior as well. And if we have a student or youth with trauma who needs healing, the errors they make with behavior, if they're pointed out, can activate that once again. And can forbid the healing in a sense, right? I'm just going into learning requires exploration. We're always encouraging, especially in Montessori and some styles of learning, right? Exploration. And we want students to kind of share their strengths with us so that we can provide even more strategies so they can learn further. And so that exploration is part of it. But if you look at behavior, students should not explore limits. So my expectation is that you put your pencil down, and I say put your pencil down. And so if you can't do that, then we have a real issue. Because that's my expectation for that behavior. You put it down when I say it. Well, that's not really allowing for any exploration, right? I would be the child that would be waving the pencil back at you. If you've got to tell me that, I want to know why. When you say it, it needs to go down on the table. And teachers can do that, right? Because we're all going to move to the next activity. We're going to transition into this next piece. So I need to see pencils down. So allowing for exploration and some challenge. Some of our best learners challenge teachers. I had a teacher, just quickly, and then I'm going to move on, a Latin teacher. And I had so many questions because I didn't understand Latin well. Imagine that. And I was kind of dead too after one lesson or two. But I kept asking questions because I wanted to know. I wanted to know how to do it. I wanted a good grade. Who doesn't, right? And one day I came up and I asked a question and he looked at me and he goes, go sit down. You know the answer to that. And I said to him, I said, aren't you the teacher? And he said, I am. And I said, shouldn't I be able to ask questions of my teacher for learning? He's like, okay, Kurt, what's your question? So I think when they're able to explore, and not just academically with behavior, it brings out that that skill set of those that we view as probably more challenging. Academic learning difficulties signal a need. So behavioral, we're just going to fix it. We're going to fix it so that the behavior never happens again. You know, behavioral difficulties, it's not a matter of suppression. It's a matter of taking a look at what's going on. Let's look at our solutions that we have once we find that out. Okay. moving on. So restorative justice, like SaraGrace shared, this is not a training for that. Although there are some that are very good. So if you'd like that information later, just contact one of us. But it doesn't always take care of everything. You know, the historical roots go back to Native and Indigenous tribes. And also here, the approach of the justice system. It's been used for that. So, you know, as we talk further, if you're thinking about your own classroom, if you're thinking about your district, if you're thinking about your school, and you look at this and you say, there's no way this RJ would ever work. Maybe it won't in a given situation, but maybe it will. Okay. So we're just here to point out it's not going to be the silver bullet. And I'm sorry to use that word. It's not a great word when we're talking about healing informed, but it's not a magic thing that's going to take care of everything. And in education, if you've been in education long enough, you would know there's not just one answer. So I'm going to pass it back to you, and I think this is you. This is me. All right, so this is, you know, a tool.
So I believe the link is going in the chat for our virtual participants. And we're a little short on handouts, so I am going to pass these out. If you are here with a partner from your site or district or someone you connect with already, maybe see if you can share. And I'm going to go make some copies while we're working on this.
So as she passes this tool around, I'm going to point out just once you receive it, I want you to focus in on the question in the bubble. So once you receive it, and if you don't, just take a look up here and you can follow me and she'll bring back a copy for you. So one of the parts of restorative justice that's really prominent as you look at restorative justice is there's been an incident that's occurred, and following that incident, an assigned punishment. And that punishment varies and the incident varies, of course. So looking at this question, how have you welcomed back a youth into your education environment after an absence? When we're referring to absence in this question, we're referring to a youth that has been maybe removed from your classroom for a period of time and due to an incident or something that's impacted the classroom. So you take a look, and this is where you'll kind of see the connection, right, to MTSS. So you've got some things that you put in place for all youth in your space, so that when the youth comes back in your room, everyone's ready to get started. Okay. There are some things that are more targeted depending on what has occurred and what you need to apply so that the student does come in welcomed. And then there are some systematic approaches, right? And if you are a member of an IEP team, which I know you all are at some point in time, then there are some systematic things which are written into that plan so that the child can come back into this space and learn. So just in your groups, you're pretty well grouped off. If you'll just spend just a few minutes, let's take 5 minutes and really take a look at this question. And it's brainstorming, right? So, you know, I'm not going to address any behaviors. You can talk with each other. And you don't have to, if you want to save this, just make some notes for yourself, okay? But try to look at what you have inside your space or at your schools for your district office. or if you're an administrator within your classrooms and your teachers, where the youth could be welcomed back into this space after a time of departure for all students, and then for those that need specialized targeted assistance, and then the ones with intensive need.
We're going to focus on this one at the intensive level. So a student has been out of your classroom for some reason, medical leave, disciplinary action, who knows? How does that student get reintegrated and welcomed back into the classroom? That's an intensive level of intervention.
Share examples are good. Let me give you a couple of examples just as you're chatting. So checking in is an example. So some teachers, would spend that moment having a conversation with the youth and just checking in with them. Wouldn't be in front of the group, but it would be in a space that's more private. Right. So that's one example, a conversation or check-in. Yeah.
And then
It's a very short.
And then we'll
It's a broad question.
we'll give them. For maybe a minute of share out.
If I just say they have the reintroduction meeting, they tell you, hey, look, you get back to your class. Like, that's what we do in school. Our response to that is, you know, something. Necessarily first like this year. They go for our time, it's maybe big deal. They're not going to but I'm also like not making feel bad about it. Oh, no, let's put that. Not people get seen, let's give them a shot. Okay, give you Robert. Go. Yeah. I know you had
Right. Yeah.
That's one example, but each gets different. Yeah, like one can be, it might just be like, whatever, I don't even.
Okay, this is one of those moments where all the students say, you said 5 minutes, you said 5 minutes. And your teacher's like, I did. But we have to change that up. So let me give you just a few seconds to finish up your conversations and we'll come back together.
Yeah, like, it's not. Like some of these things are like literally inclusive, it's like you can understand.
So raise your hand if you can hear and see me. Oh, good. I have a few hands up. And so I was just walking a little bit and some really great conversations. And I have to say, because I have district administrators and school site administrators here, a suggestion sometimes during your professional learning is to allow for these types of conversations, because the feedback you get as a district office administrator can be invaluable to you in working with your district. So those are just a couple of asides for you. And I wouldn't say it unless I've done it. Okay, so yeah, we're going to take a minute or so to share. Do I have any brave volunteers at all? I can just signal me with your hand. All right, and I heard great stuff over here.
I don't know, like.
Sorry. Oh,
Is the virtual. I've got some virtual.
Oh God, I'm sorry. All right. So I think one of the things that we were talking about was the question was very broad. So we tried narrowing it down to, okay, we have a student that gets suspended because of some sort of situation. And it was important as we were discussing to like be our most authentic self as educators. So like me personally and Mr. Vera as well, like we had if we had a student that came back in, the advisors would do their thing where they come in, they reintroduce the student, they do their job, right? Me as an educator, like tell the kid I love him, tell him I'm stoked to have him back. Let's get back to work. Like it becomes a thing where I don't want to I don't want to make a big deal out of something that I'm like, dude, I'm just excited to have you back in class. Let's go. Like, let's put in the work. Because I think if you do something like that at our school, especially because we have differing student populations, like I think if you're not authentic with these kids, like they read it and they know you're full of crap. And so like the importance of authenticity, especially where we teach, is so quintessential to them enjoying our classroom and being willing to come back versus just being wandering.
So thank you so much for sharing. And I know that others in the room appreciated that. I will say, you know, telling a student that you love them, and we do it in different ways, right? That is a really big deal. And I know you said it's naturally a part of you as an educator, which is great, but that is a big deal. And that can't be forgotten. And the kids will know right away. Okay, another, yes.
They said teachers at our school will often check in one-on-one with the students as they walk in or give them a warm welcome back. We're glad you're here. We'll also sometimes have our MTSS IA do a warm handoff by taking a walk around the field and entering the room with them to make sure they have support when remain regulated. We also do reentry meetings in the morning prior to sending the student back to class. Sometimes just me, I believe Jessica's an administrator. Sometimes the counselor is there as well.
Those are all really great suggestions, and so thank you to her. And one more, and then we'll move forward. When we talk about restorative circles, I just want to say that that is a technique sometimes at some point after they've done reentry that you can utilize to bring everybody back to that safe space.
I love what I'm hearing about community, because building community, that's at that base foundational level of our MTSS approach. If we have a welcoming community and students know that their teachers care about them, that is a universal intervention, and it's the foundation, and it makes everything else easier, because 80% of the need on a campus should be met in that universal tier. And also, things sometimes happen. And depending on what the thing was that happened, maybe the reason the student was out has to do with a suspension related to something that affected your classroom. Well, when the student comes back, the students are going to talk about that. There is going to be communication about that between the students. And the question is, do you want to facilitate that and control how that conversation goes and give it an outlet, or are we going to let it happen naturally? Either one is a choice. Restorative justice is a process that puts that choice in the whole community, so that that classroom community gets a chance to debrief that experience, so that the kids have open cortex, so that the one who's returning doesn't feel that they're in fight or flight because they're not sure if they're safe in the classroom or what everybody is thinking about them. And for teens, adolescents, that what is everybody thinking about me is a big deal, right? And if there is someone who maybe was a victim in that incident in your classroom, how are they going to feel? So restorative justice is a process that brings in that community conversation and builds off of the the expectation and the relationships that are built in the community. Yes.
I'm feeling a little bit, thank you. I've enjoyed the past 2 days. There are staff at my school that I wish were here. And I want to be able to bring this back to our school with a little bit more than just, oh, it was great, and here's what we talked about. Like, I really want to try to like push my leadership a little bit to making some changes. Is there a book or something that you would recommend taking back in addition to the learning that we've done here?
Yeah, let's connect afterwards. Are you in county?
Yes.
Okay, let's connect. SCCOE is a resource, and I can think of a few things off the top of my head that we might be able to help you with. All right. So we're going to talk a little bit about the difference between restorative justice and restorative practices, because language matters. And I'm flipping back and forth a little bit. In your universal, targeted, and intensive tiers that you have in front of you on your handout, when we think of restorative justice, that is sort of the overarching theory, but it's really like the restorative justice practices. That means that there's been something that needs to be, has the justice part, right? Like there's something that's the intensive level of intervention. Restorative practices are the community building, the foundational, the preventive side of that continuum, right? So on the continuum, there are restorative practices that establish a community. And then moving forward, when something has happened, restorative justice is the restitution, the community practice, the acknowledgement that there has been a break in something, a break in community, a break in relationship, a break in trust, and that needs to be restored. Okay, so when we flip back and forth between restorative practice and restorative justice, I just want to acknowledge that. And also, IEP meetings can be a restorative practice, can be a form of a restorative circle, depending on how we're running them and how we're hearing all of the participants in the meeting. We have another quick clip with Dr. Perry.
How does understanding what happened to a child bring clarity to why a child purposely acts out?
A lot of times when a teacher has a child who acts out in the class, they feel as if it's personalized, as if the misbehavior is directed towards them. And in fact, it very rarely is. If a child has a history of trauma, it's because the behavior is kind of a manifestation at times of the fight or flight response. You know, whether it's physical proximity becomes an evocative cue. Every time any other adult got close to me and came up behind me, they were going to hurt me. So when the teacher comes over my shoulder to try to help me and they blow up and say, "Get away from me," that's basically a completely predictable defensive behavior by the child, but a completely confusing, aggressive behavior to the teacher. And again, one of the things that we've been able to do with educators is if we teach them about trauma and about these responses, they begin to shift the way they understand the child. They no longer take it personally. They ask what happened to you. Sometimes they may not know what happened, but they realize something did happen.
Something happened.
Yeah, and so they can then change the way they treat.
Shifting the language is an important part of restorative practice. And with Oprah's first question in that clip, what about when students purposefully act out? What have we learned already? It's not purposeful, right? This is a reaction. This is a fight or flight mechanism that is working in that student's brain. And that Dr. Perry talks about shifting the language from what's wrong with you, which might be our initial reaction as an educator when we see a big reaction from a student in a classroom, to what happened to you? What happened to you that prompted that response? And when we think about what happened to you, We need to recognize we don't need to know what it was, but that it happened. Not the what, but the that. And it is communicating something. All behavior is communication. This is, again, where my special education staff knows this and relies on this heavily, right? It is true for nonverbal students, and it is true for students who choose not to verbalize. So this is where we want to be mindful of that shift in language, and where maybe we can support our teachers to recognize that it's not about them. It's not an attack. There's a communication piece behind it. The communication is that the student might be saying that something happened to them that is causing them to be dysregulated. So how does your team, to turn to your table groups for a minute, think about how does your team equip teachers to de-escalate and help students to regulate in the classroom? And this is tricky. This is tricky. So think about student self-regulation strategies, rocking in chairs, chewing gum. Ooh, I'm going to get in trouble with some administrators for suggesting that, but that is self-regulation. Providing options. We did a training like this, and a teacher said, what I do is I tell my students, it's okay with me if you want to go sit outside for a minute. You don't have to do it. I'm not telling you to do it, but it's okay if you want to do that. It's okay with me if you want to go check in at the counseling center. You don't have to, but if you get up and walk out, I'm not going to stop you. So think in your table group for a minute, and then we'll have a share out of these targeted interventions. Something has happened in the classroom, but can it stay in the classroom? How can we equip our teachers to help students regulate?
Because it's an area of control you have versus when you're outside, when you get in class, it's so controlled, such a hostile environment that you're actually dealing with less people because somebody else is making you don't want more time, guys? I got something.
That it's okay for me.
Yeah. We also need to regulate. So we do have a new system this year at our school, a pass system. And so, but there's only a few choices. And counseling is one of them. They help them, but that's not counseling. But if I put it, I have a Chromebook sitting on my desk facing away from me that I put it in what they call kiosk mode.
We're going to wrap up in about 30 seconds and have an opportunity to share out. Look at these overachievers. That took like 5 seconds for you all to settle down. And we hate to quell this great conversation that is happening. We do hope that you take these conversations back, because 75 minutes is not enough to give you the time to process all of the tools that you currently have in your toolkit and maybe even pick up some new ones. We had a great comment in the chat about using SEL curriculum, which it gets into our universal, right? If all classrooms are doing SEL, then that is a universal intervention, but also another mention of the MTSS IA, which I love that idea. Not everybody has that staffing assignment, but if this is the kind of thing to bring back to your district administration, if you have the staffing for someone to be an MTSS IA, imagine the possibilities and where you can add supports. Yes. Instructional associate is how I was interpreting that, but we can maybe clarify from the chat. Oh, no, I see a nod. Yes. So IA, instructional associate. One of my previous roles at a school site was MTSS coordinator for the school site. But that means that I had a whole bunch of other things also under, like 504 coordinator and SST coordinator and peer tutoring coordinator and all of the other things, right? But imagine if you had a dedicated person who could really be that universal and targeted and maybe even do some intensive interventions with students on campus. Okay, we're going to move forward and think about our universal level of interventions.
So some of you have raised questions about, having more resources or where to go. So do we, is this next?
Oh, sorry. That's me.
So this information is just a sample of some other resources. And these are available. You can just contact us. But, we talk about greeting students. And if you've used Capturing Kids' Hearts, that's one program that some schools use. But the idea, of course, and you'll see like the evidence there, is to make sure each student, when they come into your space as an educator, does feel like they're a part of it in a positive way. So making sure to note that. My name, my identity is very important. And I remember as a teacher, oftentimes I'd look through my roster and practice because I felt like I wanted to make sure that if I had questions, I could go ask the front office first before I made a mistake. And so especially if a youth has been referred to in situations that are traumatic in a negative way, their name can become very important to them because that's what they hold on to. Community circles is another, just a strategy that's used. Some schools use morning circles, some use afternoon circles, some use a form of restorative practice with their circles. But the teacher has the ability to gauge many things in that circle. The temperature for safety, the temperature for what's going to happen at the end of the day, right? And the temperature for what do I need to communicate to my front office for further safety for a child. So community circles, and then explicit instruction. You will have students coming into your rooms that are brand new and they won't know anyone. My own children are brand new to this area up here. And my son is not dealing with it well. And he's an 8th grader. And so, this is something which we are thankful for his teachers. And so that you have a big impact on children, and you may not realize some days you do. And so making sure that they feel less anxious, right, in your space. So these are some example strategies that we have here at the county office, and we can chat with you further about them. And then like SaraGrace had shared, going back to that universal targeted and intensive work, What are your practices, policies, and procedures, at your site, or if you're at the district office within your sites that you're working on having within your sites to create a welcoming space and also inclusive for all your students. You would know that if you look at your students on your caseload, those of you that work as special education teachers, you will know that each of your children are different. And there are certain needs they have. So what are practices, policies, and procedures at your site that assist you with making sure you meet every individual need, right? It's a very tall order, and teaching is not easy. So take some time here and take a look at that question. Think about, what position you are in as an educator, district, school site, classroom, part of that classroom, and spend a little bit of time talking together about policies, procedures, practices, where you're at. It can be wishful thinking as well. Okay, so we're going to come back together here. I do want to mention the aspirational work. SaraGrace and I just spoke about that. As educators, we are always aspiring, right, to improve, to work together, to create systems. Those are aspirational. Like I said earlier, if you're perfect, I'd like to meet you after. You can come shake my hand. But aspirational work is a lot of what happens in our school districts, right? In our schools. And so that's like the spark. When aspiration is lost, then we need to start asking ourselves different questions.
Anyone want to share out anything from their universal strategies? Okay.
Jessica from the virtual audience shares that at our school site has 2 extensive support needs SDC classes that are brand new to our school this year. Our team has been meeting quite a bit to figure out the best way to be more inclusive. The students are starting to join their gen ed peers during more parts of the day, but it has been a couple of months of learning and improvement for us.
How many of you have lived through a transition from a more segregated model to a more inclusive model? Like going from SDC classes for SLD to going to co-taught classes? Yeah, whoo, there are some bumps in that road. And it's really hard. But again, this is where the aspiration comes in. Like in a perfect world, what are the things? Let's start throwing things out. Not everything's going to stick. Not everything's going to work. But if we don't aspire to something that is more in line with our vision, then we won't get there. We're going back to our MTSS pyramid in the context of restorative practices and restorative justice. These things may be happening already at your school site. So you're not that far away. There are restorative practices that happen in holding a morning meeting. At my kids' school site, they do Monday morning flag salute, or they do Monday morning PBS assembly. Everyone at the school hears what the PBIS system is, what their focus is for that week. And then they do Friday flag salutes. The whole school starts together on Mondays and ends together on Fridays. Alternatives to suspension, a lot of these already happen. Maybe you're not doing youth court and restitution, but if you have some conflict mediation strategies happening on campus, that is a form of restorative justice that your school is bringing in. And returning from suspension, that postvention, the postvention, after we've done the thing has happened, we've done the intervention, and now we're following up and we're welcoming the student back in with intention. So these are things that you might already be doing or that you might aspire to with your team. And when you're in those conversations, again, this is not to train you to go out and bring restorative justice to your classroom and to your school, and now it'll all work. But as your team talks about rolling out MTSS in your setting, you have, I hope, some strategies and some information to help advocate for restorative justice as a trauma-informed MTSS approach so that you can take this back to your teams. We don't have a lot of time right now for our last group share, which was going to be planning your team. Who are your allies? Who can you bring in? Who do you need to work with? What data is this team going to review so that you can move forward? So these might be some questions to take with you as you move out into the next, as you take this work. Hold on to that worksheet. We also have a digital version of it for the Zoom that we can share. Take this to your teams and move forward with the work. Are there any, since we don't have a lot of time to plan in teams, are there any questions about what we covered today or about where to go from here? In that case, I am not going to stand between you and meeting your physiological needs. And I will let you go a few minutes early. If you do want to hang back to talk about any resources or to hear a personal anecdote about trauma in an IEP meeting, you're welcome to hang back. Thank you, everyone. Let me make sure that our virtual person has our